by sort of picking up on a couple of the themes that you talked about, and sort of push back a little on a couple of things.
Man, this chair goes way back.
Yeah, that's why I didn't sit back. It would look, yeah. So in funding journalism,
yes,
through these endowments or foundations, do they run a risk of not having the journalism be taken credibly if the funding comes from a source with a political agenda? And I realize you don't think that there's a political agenda here, but if it's perceived to be a political agenda, either on the social justice front or on a liberal front or on a conservative front, then the journalism that they're underwriting, does that become undermined?
So I think we have to get over the idea that people don't hold that suspicion anyway about all media. I mean, that's just, and it's not as though that's new. You know, my first job in journalism was as a copy aide at a newspaper, and I remember how people absolutely tried to deal with the fact that their single largest advertiser seems to have the ability to whipsaw coverage in a way that nobody liked. And I think it has always been a struggle for news organizations to manage the fact that somebody pays for what they do. And I think the ones with integrity do that by making clear what their boundaries are and then not letting them be crossed. I think foundations that are funding in this space, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, are funding in the same sort of way. We offer money to organizations to do work, but we don't tell them what to cover, and we don't tell them what to do. I will tell you that the organizations I get as a foundation head, the organizations I get the most complaints about from powerful people are advocacy organizations, which are also kind of in this space, and news organizations. And the attempt is to make us step in and play the role of silencing those organizations. And we emphatically don't do it. Does that change the impression, the fact that we fund them, does it change the impression that they're neutral? Well, you know, I think if you're in the news business and you're covering news in sort of an honest way about what's happening, people are going to bring their own biases to it and decide that you're liberal or conservative, aside from the fact that somebody in the background is funding them the way that we are. But I think the way we manage that and have to manage that is to be very clear about the boundaries.
I always said that as a journalist, my job was never to be objective. I don't think objectivity is a false premise. My job was to be fair. Fairness is what all journalism should strive for.
Well, and I think, you know, Dana said something this morning that among many things that she said that I loved, and a few that I hated because it's just too scary, but because I realized I am old. But one of the things her answer about bias was one of the best I've ever heard given. And not to try and recapture that statement, but in my way of viewing it is that in an era where there is an extreme that is trying to define the center further and further and further in one direction, the notion of balance is out of balance. You know, you can't just keep moving over and saying that you're being balanced. What you're doing is being pulled. And I think the position of integrity is not to default to putting up the extreme person, but to have a reasonable conversation.
Well, when you say we're not neutral in this struggle, as one of your ways of going at it, that will sound to some people as advocacy for a particular point of view.
Well, I would say we're not neutral about whether our democratic system should be preserved. I don't think we should be neutral about the First Amendment. I don't think we should be neutral about everybody in our society having value, regardless of the color of their skin or their gender or any other consideration. You and I were just having an amazing conversation a moment ago where you shared something, if I can, about your program, where you had a guest appear on your program who's a leading politician here in Florida. Speaker of the House?
Speaker of
Is
the
that
House,
right?
yeah.
Okay. So, and this guy referred to...
Well, let's not, I don't want to cheat too much. It's my show on this Sunday. Anyone here this Sunday can tune in and find it. I don't want, but yes, he said some controversial things.
Okay, so he said some controversial things. And
Tune in Sunday at 11:30 on CBS. We stream online too if you're back in your homes on cbsmiami.com.
So the term in question was directed at women and as dehumanizing as I can imagine. And should we be neutral on that? No. We're not, you know, if we're neutral on that, then we have no values as institutions. Because guess what? The role of this sector is to advance inclusion and to advance equity and to make society better. And you don't get there by pretending that you don't care about hate.
So I want to shift a little bit to the notion of local coverage and hyperlocal. I'll share a story. I worked for Miami New Times, a weekly newspaper here. Then I went to work. Alberta was nice enough to hire me to come and work at the Miami Herald. Alberta left. I got fired from the Herald, so he's not responsible for that. But apart from that, when I was critiquing the Herald, both inside the Herald and as a writer before that at the Alternative Weekly, one of the things I always said was the Herald does big things really well. That wins them Pulitzers. They are amazing at the big things. Where it often falls short is the covering the small local governments. How much of the foundations need to guard against ego driving them? If you want to fund something, you may want to fund something that creates a big splash in terms of what it's covering. Whereas in some ways, what you really need is that minutia of a local city hall being properly covered, which isn't sexy, but is vital.
So but as I was thinking about this talk, I spoke with a couple of our grantees, and I asked Mila Sanina, who's the editor of Public Source, about what are her proudest stories. And she grouped them into two categories. One was about changing the narrative in society, and she pointed to examples of stories that put a human face on the opioid crisis, which is a big deal in our broader region. And she talked about a project they did to engage young African-American girls in journalism, and a couple of others. And then on the other category was accountability in government, and she pointed to a series of articles they'd done about our problem with lead in the drinking water, kind of scary and very serious, and they've done really good work to try and raise attention to that. And accountability that they've tried to bring to reporting on the police department and so forth. None of these has been a blockbuster story. And I think that's perfectly fine. You know, the notion wasn't necessarily, from our perspective, go out and win a Pulitzer. The notion was be a force for helping our community understand what's happening, number one, and help hold people accountable for doing their jobs. And that's the standard by which we measure them, and I think should measure them, not the big blockbuster deal.
Do you worry, though, that is there a tendency among foundations or endowments to want to look for the big blockbuster because they have to prove that their worth is there? In other words, I guess what I'm saying is, how egotistical are these people out here? How much is their ego driving them versus what they want to accomplish?
We are stunningly egotistical. No, I actually don't think. I don't think that is a driver. I think actually the opposite tends to be true. When you do this work in a community, you get the calls that I get. And you know, trust me, the political leaders in a community are the ones, from a foundation perspective, you most need to collaborate with to achieve scale on your work. So if there's any sensitivity that you're likely to be more susceptible to, it's pressure from political leadership than it is the desire for some big blockbuster on the other side. I don't think the driver is, the driver is to influence the community conversation in a significant way.
And we'll throw it open to the crowd in about a minute or so, but last question I wanted to ask you, and then we'll start hearing from others. It deals more with the, it just left my head. So let's go to the crowd, and I'm sure it'll come back to me in a second.
I'm so glad that happened to you.
Who has a question?
Questions. We have mic runners in the back. There's a question here in the middle coming your way. If you stand up, it's a little bit easier, sir. Thank you. It's also helpful if you give your name.
And let's try to keep it as much to questions and not speeches.
Arthur Salomon, Lexington, Kentucky. What has created the divide in our country that can't be fixed?
So do that for a minute.
Wow.
Take a minute for that.
Yeah. Yeah, so, wow. I think I have to go now. First of all, I'd question the premise. I think it can be fixed. I think the moment that we're in is what happens when new technology, disruption in society, meets up with a moment of retrenchment against significant social change. You know, the biggest criticism and complaint I have with the very famous quote about, from Martin Luther King about the arc of destiny bending towards justice is that it implies that there is a continuous process of getting there. And if you look at the history of how social change happens, it happens in fits and spurts. You have a few steps forward, and then you get knocked back. There is always movement and a reaction, movement and a reaction. And we're in the middle of a reaction, and it's aided and abetted by a highly disruptive set of technologies that complicate having a middle ground. So I think that the answer is we have to recreate the middle ground.
What technology are you referring to when you say?
Well, everything that Dana spoke about this morning. So it's the online world,
Gotcha. Okay.
which is changing who we identify with and how we get our news and our information. And I think what we have to do is continue at a community level, because people get it at a community level. You know, and it's very easy to hate people nationally. It's a lot harder to do it when you're around them. And you know, I saw a TED Talk once, and I forget the guy's name. I wish I remembered it, but he had the most disarming premise for a a podcast. He built a whole podcast about how he was openly gay and talked about issues in his community, and about how he would get hate mail from people, you know, hate email, and how he would be just showered with this stuff. So his podcast was, he called those people and said, "Why did you say that?" And what happened an amazing number of times is people said, "Well, I don't know, now that you call me." So, you know, where we have an opportunity to do this is at the community level, but we've got to rebuild the ways in which people get together and have those conversations.
All right, we have a question over here.
Aloha, I'm Sean McLaughlin, Access Humboldt in Eureka, California. I have a question. It's fascinating because in the legacy model of cable access, community media has been the hyper-local video source in communities that have it, and I know Pittsburgh has had some. And that whole industry is going away besides cutting the cord, the regulatory model is going away. But I'm just wondering, as you're looking for new models, is anybody considering the successes and accomplishments of that whole legacy infrastructure that never quite bridged with mainstream media, or even, you know, journalism hasn't anyway, you get my point. Is we've been covering gavel to gavel local meetings for years, and journalists borrow our stuff, but we haven't really built the bridge between the two.
Yeah.
Do you see an opportunity there?
It's probably more a question for the night team than it is for me, because we haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it. You know, my immediate observation would be, you know, in having watched it, is that it just isn't the sort of thing that people watch anymore. You know, if PD, whatever his name is, you know, has 87 million viewers, he's not doing it by showing a 2-hour hearing. And, you know, so I think the question of how you make information relevant to a very different audience is one, if that particular approach is going to survive, it's going to have to figure out that bridge to being relevant. And, you know, this is the question across the board for all of us, by the way. You know, the models are fully in play now, and everybody gets irritable because we want an immediate solution. I remember a decade ago being in a conversation with Clay Shirky at NYU, where he talked about the imminent demise of journalism, and one of the things he said was, it will eventually be replaced but it'll be replaced by 17 things, not one thing, and none of them exist today. And boy, was that prophetic. And so I don't know. Wasn't that a long and eloquent way of saying I don't know?
Okay, question over here. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Grant. This is John Funabiki at Renaissance Journalism.
Hey,
Thank
John.
you very much for a great talk. You gave us a list of 10 toxins. I want to add one more thing for you to worry about and for all of us to worry about. A few weeks ago, Supreme Court Justice Charles Thomas suggested that the court ought to reconsider the historic Times versus Sullivan case.
Yep.
And I wondered what your thoughts were about that, and also whether you thought he might be sending a signal out to some folks who might litigate that.
Yeah, of course he is, and you know that is one of the most important pieces of legislation around freedom of speech and protection from libel that protects the First Amendment in our country. And I think, you know, we have seen the president say any number of times that he doesn't believe that journalists should be able to say what they think. You know, that there should be some control on what they say. And that is the environment that we're operating in. And he's not alone. You know, I think we are seeing folks at every level of government suddenly feel a lot more willing to say journalists are being irresponsible by saying X, Y, or Z, and they shouldn't be allowed to say that. And the people, you know, it is axiomatic that people in power always want the pests who are an alternative source of power to go away. And I think we're seeing a very dangerous crack in the dam of protections against that. So I worry about it, and I worry about it, you know, as a toxin in society, the decreasing respect for freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. That is a real concern for us. And it, by the way, comes from the left as well, but the threat I'm seeing right now is particularly from the right.
Have you been following, just speaking of new journalism or online journalism and the protections that are guaranteed there and the threats to the left, have you been following the Backpage case, backpages.com, and whether or not they're
I have not.
protected? We'll leave it for another discussion. But the question I was going to ask you before, because I don't see any hands up right now, was the time that we're in, we thought, you know, I thought what you would have identified as one of the things going on is we've seen yet another wave of layoffs and buyouts, particularly in those areas that we thought were going to be that some thought were going to be the savior of journalism. The online forums like the BuzzFeeds and the Daily Beast and the others that were trying to take, okay, we don't need the old model of journalism, we can go to this new online model of journalism, and now we're finding that they're being gutted as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure many of us thought that BuzzFeed was going to be the savior of journalism, but I take your larger point. You know, we are seeing that some of these new models. You know, in some cases, I think people had illusions backed up by awesome infusions of capital driven by the new tech mania that they needed huge staffs, that maybe they're learning they didn't. And some of this may just be a sorting out process and a right sizing of an industry that's still in its infancy. And so I think we need to be careful about exaggerating every single layoff. On the other hand, and Dana mentioned this morning, you know, we are seeing a general decline in what I view as sort of the quality journalism that tells the stories of, you know, that gives depth, that gives perspective, that humanizes people left and right so that we can see each other across divides, that investigates into difficult stories. You could lay off 300 BuzzFeed journalists and it wouldn't make a difference in my life. But lay off that number of people from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, it would make a substantial difference in what the nation understands about what's happening in our economy and in Washington.
Okay, clearly not a fan of BuzzFeed.
No, it's not. I'm not against BuzzFeed. It's just, I'm too often a victim of its clickbait. But
One last question.
Sure, do we have one?
No,
Okay. So, did I hear yes? Go ahead, stand up and shout. I'll take that as a question.
Right. I think I'm so glad you made this point.
And if
because
only she had a microphone, so everyone could have heard her.
So the point was about the democratization of media and pointing in specifically to the case of African American media that are giving exposure to voices that often in the past weren't given that exposure. And I actually think this is part of the good news story that isn't being told right now. You know, we tend to view all of these changes as so dire and negative. But this process of putting the ability to give expression to people who never had that ability before is huge. And it's particularly, you know, we see it unfortunately being leveraged really well by, in the scary cases that Dana mentioned, by the anti-vaxxers and so on. But in Pittsburgh, we fund an organization called One Hood, which works on giving voice to young African Americans in the community through rap and through the use of media. And one of the things they've started is something called an Artivist Academy, where they're actually working with young members of their community to combine their skills in art and in the use of media. So storytelling and media, and then combining that with activism in the community, and that sort of tool that sort of capacity didn't exist before the changes that we're having now, and I think it's something to be celebrated, and that's one of the other ways in which we can invest in this work.
All right, I
Thank
want to
you.
thank everyone. Let's give a round of applause to Grand Oliphant. Thank you very much. This is great.